Hi there. In this lecture we see a very instructive game of Aleksandrovich Alekhine against Tarrasch. So yeah, middle game themes which we can get from these games are going to be really valuable for our chess generally. This game was played in 1914, Mannheim tournament round 9. Alekhine kicks off with e4, Tarrasch plays e5. We enter into the Italian game with bishop c4, the gioco piano, and now c3. This is the classical variation. We have queen e7, which actually has got a name. It's called the closed variation. The most usual move nowadays, and what is thought to be more accurate, is knight f6, keeping it as just the classical variation. But with queen e7, we're in the classical variation, closed variation. So here d4 is played. In this position, d4 is among the top 3 strongest moves. So b4, d4, or castling, they're all kind of about as strong as each other, as we know from modern engines, the evidence of modern engine analysis. So anyway, d4, we have the bishop dropping to b6. If e takes d4, this is very interesting. With the queen on e7, guess what we can play here? And actually we do have a significant advantage in this position. Yeah, castling is the way to go here. This avoids the ideas of c takes bishop b4 check. If d takes, knight takes c3, that queen is, we're going to get a big tempo gain from her. With knight d5, this position b4, this is going to be a really great position. Here we could target f7, that soft spot, pretty direct play. Bishop b2, and this is a very scary position for black indeed. If black castles here, guess what we can play, which is basically just a winning move for 100 points. What would you play here? With f7 pinned, there's less defensive capability. Just the immediate threat of mate with queen takes g7 is hard to parry. Black's going to have to do delaying tactics. So just delay getting mated. Yeah, knight f5 protects g7. But yeah, black's going to get mated. Yeah, it shows how dangerous this is, especially if d takes c3 here. If knight f6 though, c takes d4, and we get a rolling pawn center a bit. Bishop d3, d5, we can take on d6 en passant. And then here, bishop takes e4, queen takes rook e1 as example. Yeah, these are kind of really vicious examples. But yeah, it is kind of a problematic position. Where does the knight want to go? It's going to be a big advantage. So yes, e takes d4 is a really bad idea. So bishop b6 is played, which makes sense. The knight and the queen are holding e5, trying to encourage d5, which kind of closes up the position, hence the name closed variation. We have white castling, d6. Now here, actually d5 might not be the strongest move, so Alekhine chooses a4. We see in another game, Paul Morphy in an earlier generation played h3. This is also, these two moves are considered among two of the absolute best moves in the position, and along with rook e1. So yeah, a4 is a very decent move. We have a6. There was a key threat along with a4. If knight f6, guess what we play here for 100 points? We can actually play to win material with the move d5. Let's assume knight d8. Then what would be the point? Yeah, c3 is a bit cheeky here. It's no longer about d4, it's about controlling d4. We can play a5, and then we can trap the bishop with b4. We're winning a piece here. So okay, so a6 gives the bishop on b6 an escape path. We have bishop e3, bishop g4, d5 now. So it is a closed position now by nature as well as by name. So a5, bishop takes e3, f takes. The double pawns here, they have upsides. They control key squares. We've also got this semi-open f file to play with. On the semi-open f file, the f5 outpost could be interesting. Bear that in mind. Knight f6, knight bd2, protecting e4. Knight bd7, queen e1. We have knight c5. And actually the queen goes to b1 here. Bishop c8, and now this knight's kicked back, so it's no longer putting pressure on e4. Now, guess what Alekhine plays? Now that the bishop is not looking at f5, well, this is a moment. What do you think is a good move here for 10 points? Yeah, knight h4 is possible here. We want to try and get into that f5 square. We have g6. If knight takes e4, this tactic is not working, opening up an attack. And for what reason do you think? For what reason isn't this working? What would you play here if knight takes e4? Yeah, the best move, I mean, you might want to pause the video. The best move is just queen takes e4, just protecting h4. If we played knight f5 here, no, there's knight takes d2 hitting our queen. And this position is actually going to be better for black. Okay, so, yeah. But we know that knight takes e4 is, you know, we answer with queen takes e4. So g6, we have queen e1. And now here, the queen is protecting h4, back to e1. There's no knight c5 now, different story. Knight h to f3, c takes, e takes, and now e4. So here, it does seem the most accurate may actually be the kind of straightforward knight d4. This seems to be the most accurate. So as example, with knight e5, bishop b3, this position, it doesn't actually matter about knight d3. We can play queen h4. And here, say knight g4, we can take the queens off and take on e4. We're hitting d3. So this isn't good for black, this position. Knight d4 does seem to have a lot to it. It does seem simple and strong to centralize the knight, make it a kind of multi-purpose piece. So yes, it's interesting. But knight g5, it has got some perks of being provocative, as Alekhine played knight g5. He's trying to provoke black here into playing g5 at some point. We have queen e5. Now this looks like, well, maybe tempting knight g4 to threaten queen takes h2, get some concessions out of white. But actually, the move... Okay, so black could do better than queen e5. g5 would be giving the f5 square to white. Pawns don't go backwards. So this position is better for white. If castling, that is actually fairly accurate here. Say queen h4, king g7, knight f4, g5 is possible. And in this position, knight e5, black's actually going to get a small edge. So casting would have been decent. Knight e5 is also accurate here. If the bishop drops to e2, black can actually take on h3 and then actually take on d5. This position, black could castle queenside and claim a small edge. Another interesting possibility here, which Alekhine mentioned, and maybe is actually more likely than bishop e2, which is what modern engines think. Maybe Alekhine wouldn't have liked his pawns doubled. He did actually mention, it seems, knight f4 here. Now, black is slightly better. If black doesn't just routinely castle, there is actually a really aggressive move here, h5. And white's best maybe h4, because this knight itself might be a victim of g5. If we play h4, we do loosen the g4 square though. So black could castle and then make use of the g4 square with a small edge. Now, if we didn't play h4, if we played h3, then actually, yeah, the knight could be subject to a tempo gainer. And actually h4 here, it gets to be rather dangerous because we've castled, the opponent hasn't castled, and they're attacking us with the pawns. h3, it looks a little bit scary. This position does seem to be in black's favour. This is just one example where black does seem to be doing quite well here. So anyway, interesting stuff on knight f4. If we had dropped to b3, again, bishop takes h3. Seems quite punishing for Alekhine's provocation with the knight going to h3. And this position, the two knights are actually not bad for black. Black has a significant edge here. That nice e5 square is black's. So anyway, in the game though, queen e5 is a bit of a let-off for knight h3. We have rook protecting c3. And now this knight g4 makes things worse for black actually. Although there is a mate threat, queen takes h2, checkmate. Okay, so this is actually handled. Are we going that way? This is actually handled. If queen e7 instead, well, going backwards, White is going to have an advantage now. Yeah, black's wasted time with that maneuver, but maybe that is actually objectively the better move. If queen h4 here, then g5 is possible. Knight takes g5, there's knight h7, and yeah, we've been caught here. Rook takes f7, queen takes g5, better for black. But anyway, knight g4 makes things worse for black. We have knight f4, so defending that h2 mate threat. g5, now this has weakened f5, pawns don't go backwards. So f5 has been significantly weakened. So in this position, the cool come as a cucumber, so to speak, move h3, just counter-attacking the knight on g4. Knight goes back. If g takes f4, we'd play e takes f4, and then just h takes g4. This is better for white. Look at the pressure on e4. So knight goes back. We have knight e2, knight takes d5. So black has won a pawn, but considerable permanent damage has been done to the black position. So Alekhine actually takes off the d5 knight here and now plays knight d4. So big difference. That f5 square seems extremely raw. Black structure seems very, very committed. Pawn's not going backwards. So we have queen e5 making things even worse. Knight f8. These are not good scenarios for black anyway. Queen f2. This position. We could make progress here. For example, c5. And here's c6. That c file is pretty interesting. Rook c5. And we've got numerous ideas here, in fact. So one, taking on c6. This position, rook b6, we can actually play on both sides of the board. Rook takes h6, trying to deflect the rook from f7. That would be a fun idea as example. These are all pretty crushing positions. But queen e5 makes things even worse. We have knight c4, big tempo gainer, queen d5. And guess what now? Do we defend the knight, or is there something stronger than moving the knight or trying to defend it? What do you think Alekhine plays here for 10 points? Yeah, knight f5 indirectly defends the knight. We have king f8. If queen takes c4, revenge will be taken by the other knight. Knight takes d6 check, and then taking the queen. So, king f8 is played. Knight f takes d6. Look at this f file. It's all come together for white beautifully. Rook d1, queen c6. Rook d4, pressure on e4 now. b5, yeah, black's position is busted. A takes, bishop b7. And now, guess what? White plays, which wins material, ends the game for 10 points. Yeah, knight a5. The two knights are ganging up together on b7, on the b7 bishop. So black actually resigns here at move 34. If queen takes, yeah, knight a takes b7 as example. So an interesting game of provocation to get black to play g5. So the opening, yeah, can become closed. So hence the name is kind of justified the closed variation queen e7. Just ask, the key point has to be to drop the bishop back. E takes does seem to be absolutely a dreadful position for black, as we see in the variations. But this position where white's being tempted to play d5 at some point, makes the position closed. But yes, with the exchange on e3, this is a really good plan to neutralize that dangerous-looking bishop on that diagonal. It seems a very interesting position with f5 in mind. So a very good thematic game for our kind of mental themes library of middle game positions and ideas. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as me. Thanks so much.